All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday, November 9th. As we mentioned, it seems like we actually do have an election result now, finally. Everyone happy with the result? Yeah, all good? We can finally move on with our lives and talk about other news stories. Actually, exciting news story. I don't know if you heard, or I don't know if you read, what's that? Yeah, no. Pfizer and BioNTech say that their COVID-19 vaccine is more than 90% effective in trials.
Yeah. But would you get it if it comes out?
Yeah, if it's,
First?
if it's, yeah. I mean, if the, what is it here in Canada? Food and Drug Administration, or is that? That's the U.S. What's it called in Canada here? I guess it's probably just Health Canada. Yeah, if Health Canada approves it and says it's safe and the science says it works, yeah.
There already is a vaccine, but it's not FDA approved, so it's not commercialized.
Yeah.
There's one that's gonna be, I think they started using it back in Indonesia like starting December, but it's not like recognized by the
It's true, and yeah, and Russia's been using their vaccine pretty heavily, even though it's not been thoroughly tested. So I don't know what the results of that vaccine are, or the one in Indonesia, but yeah, if it's
the one in Asia is from China.
from China,
Yeah, 'cause we get a lot of our things from China. Now they don't even get me started.
I'm not going to get you started. You can tell me after if you want, but
My country's just like,
well, but yeah, if it was federally approved and tested and legit, yeah, I would. I got my flu shot, my flu vaccination this year, so.
The blue shot.
The flu shot.
It's like the blue thing, right?
Is it blue?
Yeah, I think so.
I don't know.
They call it like blue shot.
Why do they call it the blue shot?
I don't know.
It's a flu shot. I don't know. Anyway, I got that, so hopefully I won't get the regular flu. Good morning, Faye. But anyway, so that's encouraging. I don't know if it'll turn out. I don't know if that will turn out as, the vaccine or a vaccine, but that's encouraging news anyway. Right, so for this week, don't forget there's a quiz tomorrow on on lectures 21 to 30. The lecture slides are posted and all that stuff. We'll do it the same way as we did last time. So I'll do the people who are like solely online. I will do the oral quiz with them before. So I'll do that from 10 to 11. And then if you are in Vancouver and you have been attending class, even if you're not here right now, which you should be, but if you're not, or if you are attending class normally, you should be here tomorrow to write the paper quiz. And so we'll do that from 11 to 11:45. Yeah. Do you? Is it? And that's normally your day at home. You can. I'll leave it up to you. I'll leave it up to you. Right. So don't forget about that. Don't forget about Wednesday being a holiday. Although we just heard Zerlinda do the announcement, but yeah, Wednesday's a holiday, so you don't have to come in. And yeah, those are my announcements. We have a paper due. When's the paper due?
Friday.
This Friday? Okay, that's a lot of time. Okay. So Daniel is here. Good morning, Daniel. Clara is here. Hello, Clara. Another Daniel is here. Good morning, another Daniel. Good evening, another Daniel. Gabrielle's here. Hi, Gabrielle. Vicky's here. Hello, Vicky. John is here. Good morning, John. Chan is here. Good morning. And Salah's here. Hello. And Zion is here. Good morning. And George is here. Good morning. And Canon is here. Hello. And Miles is here. Good morning. And Shimimu is here as well. Hello. Okay. So, where were we? Yes. Racism. On Friday, we were talking about the social construction of race, right? We'd kind of agreed, or at least I was trying to make the case to you that race is not really a biological thing in humans. Race is a biological term, and there are races of organisms, but it doesn't really apply to humans, right? We've been sort of genetically mixing with each other for quite some time, and so really we're all very genetically similar, right? And the ways in which we're different, we tend to differ between individuals, not really between geographic populations or ethnicities or any of that. And so, good morning, Sam. So race is not really a thing for biological humans, but of course it is something that's been socially constructed. And with humans, things that are socially constructed have meaning, particularly when a government takes up the construction of this thing in order to advance its own goals. And so for Canada, the Canadian government had goals very early on, and it used race as a way to achieve those goals. Okay, so I'm just going to jump ahead so one of the things that was happening, maybe I'll just jump ahead a few here. Yes, so when Canada became a country in 1867, which it did on July 1st, like we mentioned, it was just this little area out east here. So there's kind of a tiny little Ontario, which is quite different from what it looks like today. There's a tiny little Quebec, which is different than it is today. And most of the other land was not really claimed by the British government or the Canadian government at this point. So here in Rupert's Land, we had the Hudson's Bay Company, who still exists, trading furs with indigenous people. There's a little bit of stuff going on in British Columbia, but basically most of this continent, most of this country belongs to indigenous people at the time. But the sort of founding fathers of Canada, John A. Macdonald, our first prime minister among them, he had this kind of vision of a nation that stretched from sea to shining sea. And so he wanted a Canada that was not just this little bitty thing here, but a Canada that went all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And so initially the East had been created here. There's provinces of Canada in the East, and British Columbia was kind of slowly becoming a province, and they were enticed to join Canada, I think in 1888 or 89. One of the things that British Columbia wanted was a railway that would connect British Columbia to the rest of Canada. They didn't want to be just out in the middle of nowhere. And so the Canadian government actually built a railway that went all the way across Canada. And originally, I forget if it did end or if it was supposed to end at Port Moody. And so if you go out to Port Moody, there's a little railway museum there because that's kind of where the original railway ended. But eventually they'd extend it, and those rail lines would come into Vancouver here, almost where we see them out back. And so British Columbia enters Canada after they kind of after the Canadian government delivers on some promises. But one of the things that the Canadian government is trying to do, again, is create this country that goes from sea to sea. And so they had kind of British Columbia set up, and they had the East set up, but then they had all of this kind of empty, I'm going to say empty land because it wasn't empty, it was full of indigenous people, but all of this empty land in the middle that they needed to somehow fill, right? And so they were worried, of course, the U.S. was being kind of settled and created at this time, and so the United States sort of becomes a country around 1775, 1776. So this is about 100 years later, and at this point, the Americans are expanding westward. They're sort of taking over territories in the West. This is the time of the Old West and the gunslingers and all that kind of thing. And the Canadian government is concerned that Americans will start to kind of find their way north and settle in this central part of Canada. And if they do, we'll never be able to get rid of them. They'll claim it for the US, and it'll be a big conflict. So the Canadian government wants to get people settled in that central part of the country so that they can, excuse me, so that they can, I'm just gonna hang on here a sec. Whoops. Can I block this guy from here? No. Okay. So they want to do this so that they can fill the country, okay? But as we mentioned, unfortunately, there are indigenous people who already live here and have lived here for 12 or 13,000 years, right? Having come over when the Bering Land Bridge was connected, right? So there's an ice age, the ice age starts to warm, and there's this period where the glaciers have moved away, but the sea levels are still low. And so people can walk right across from what's now kind of northeastern Siberia right into North America, which they do, and they become the ancestors of all First Nations people in North and South America, really. We said that indigenous people are not one homogeneous group. There's a huge number of different cultures and languages and traditions that kind of evolved out of these early groups. And so sometimes we kind of think of these people as one group, but really they're not. They're a bunch of different cultures that have similarities and they're related to each other in some ways, but they're also, in some ways, they're very different as well. And so we said when this whole thing started off, we had a very kind of equal relationship between indigenous people and Europeans. And so Europeans were there weren't many of them here in Canada. Most of them were explorers or fur traders or people thinking that somehow they could get rich by coming here and looking for something, right? And again, there were far more indigenous people than Europeans. And so I'm jumping ahead because we've seen some of these slides before. And so here we had kind of a very equal relationship, right? The Europeans kind of coming into North America, even in military uniform, saying, hey, we mean you no harm, don't kill us, we've come to talk, right? And again, in the very early days, that's kind of more or less what it was. There was an equal relationship. These two groups cooperated with each other, sometimes fought with each other. At various points in Canadian history, and I'm not really good at this period of Canadian history, but the British and the French were fighting with each other, and indigenous groups ally with each side and fight against each other. At one point, we have to repel an American invasion. You know how those Americans are. And indigenous people help the British and the French fight to repel the Americans and keep them in their own country. And so, there's kind of an equal footing here. But like I mentioned, things are going to start to go downhill for indigenous people reasonably quickly, right? One of the things we said was that disease was an issue. Europeans bring with them all kinds of diseases that indigenous people's bodies have never seen or dealt with before, right? And so just like coronavirus now, because not no human, but prior to about January of this year, because no human had ever had coronavirus before, because it was the first one, or at least this COVID-19 one. Because nobody had ever had it before, everyone was equally susceptible. And it's very catchy, right? Nobody has any immunity to it. And the same thing happens here in this early period of North America, except the diseases are quite a bit worse than COVID-19. And so huge numbers of indigenous people die as a result. And again, we said that was particularly traumatic because indigenous people don't write anything down, or at least for the most part they don't. And so all of their stories, their skills, their cultural knowledge, all of it is stored up here, right? And so when 50% of your village dies, and most of those people are the elders, you lose a lot of knowledge, right? You lose a lot of you lose a big piece of culture. And so again, this is a pretty traumatic period, but again, it's unfortunately it's going to get worse for indigenous people from here on in. We mentioned there was this royal proclamation thing, which was the British crown, the British king saying, look, colonists in North America, if you want land, you'll need to buy it from the British government, from the crown. You cannot buy it from the indigenous people. we will deal with the indigenous people, and then we'll sell the land to you. That's how it's going to go. And so again, it doesn't seem like a big deal, but in saying this, the British government does admit that the land belongs to indigenous people, right? Because they're talking about acquiring it from them, so it must be theirs, right? Right, so huge numbers of people die of disease. We said that the government kind of starts to take steps to clear out the West, right? Clear out areas of population or areas of the country for people to come and farm. And so they slaughter huge numbers of these creatures here. By the way, did you look up beavers? You didn't look up beavers. You even wrote it on your hand.
Yeah, but then it washed off in the shower, and I was like, oh, it's washing off. I'll do it. And then I went into the lake.
They're fascinating animals, Ibera. Fascinating. Anyway, so the Canadian government put kind of a bounty on the heads of these bison, and so encouraging Europeans to come out here and shoot them for fun, which they did. And huge numbers are shot and wasted. And of course, this kind of creates a very difficult situation for indigenous people because they rely on every piece of this animal, right? They rely on the hides and the meat and the bones and the horns and the hooves and the tail and the organs and everything. Every part of this animal is used, right? And so they get almost everything they need to live from this animal. And so when this animal is gone, so is their ability to survive, really. And so as a result, indigenous people start to see the writing on the wall, okay? And so they start to see that, by the mid-1800s, Europeans have been coming to this Canadian area for quite some time. It doesn't seem like they're going to leave. They are sort of transforming the landscape. They're building towns and cities and railways, and they're clearing away land and starting to farm, which for the most part indigenous people never did. They never farmed at all. And so indigenous people see that the world is changing and they're going to have to adapt. They're going to have to adapt to survive. And so they go to the Canadian government. They go to the Canadian government and they say, "Hey, let's talk, right? Let's make an arrangement here." And so representatives of the Canadian government and representatives from indigenous people sit down and negotiate what the relationship is going to be, right? And that's the question. Like we're both here. Nobody's leaving, right? So what are we going to do? How are we going to live with each other? What do I owe you? What do you owe me? What's our relationship here? And so again, they sit down and they negotiate these treaties, okay? And treaties are kind of, it depends where you are in the country in terms of where they get signed. A lot of them get signed in central Canada, so places where the buffalo used to roam. So there's 11 numbered treaties that, guys, you're distracting me. Don't distract me. So there's 11 numbered treaties. There's some out in the east as well. Here in British Columbia, they actually don't sign any treaties. And so the indigenous situation was a little bit better in British Columbia than it was in other provinces like Alberta or Saskatchewan or Manitoba. But again, the two sides sit down to talk it out. And so this is what the indigenous people were looking for when they sat down. They wanted to, of course, ensure that their people survived, right? The land was changing, the way of life was changing, and they wanted to make sure that they would survive, that their culture and their people would survive. Again, they wanted to establish a relationship with the Canadian government, right? So we're a nation of indigenous people. You're a nation of white Canadians now. What's our relationship, right? And how are we going to kind of govern ourselves, right? How are you going to govern? How are we going to govern? And how's that relationship going to work, right? again, they wanted to transition to a new way of living because, again, the country was changing, right? There was farms popping up all over. There were railways popping up all over. And Indigenous people knew that they were going to have to change and adapt in order to make it in this new world, right? These people are not, they're not fools. They're as intelligent as you and I are, right? So they know, yeah, when things change, you have to adapt, right? You have to learn new skills. This is a very popular thing that you'll often see with regard to Indigenous people and treaties and the government. And it's called a wampum, and it's kind of like a belt, and it's a belt that's woven with all kinds of beads. And it was created by Indigenous people in Eastern Canada. I forget exactly which group. And it represents a treaty relationship. And symbolically, what's the symbolic? What's the symbols here? What do you see happening? What do you think these two blue bands represent? Equality? Yes, but in a much more kind of tangible sense. What do you think the blue things represent?
That they should be with the light to have some.
Oh, okay, maybe. I see where you're going there. That's not it, but I see where you're going. What do you think?
I feel like it's like something for medical related. I don't know.
Medical related?
Yeah.
It's not, but it's true. We often use blue and white as medical colors, right? So I can see how you might think that. They're aligned. They are. If this was connected to a map, what would you say? Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, Sabrina, what did you say? Right. There's a west to east or an east to west nature here. But yeah, they're actually rivers. These two represent rivers. And so there's two rivers going side by side. And the idea here is that we're each going to paddle our own canoe, right? So Indigenous people are going to paddle their canoe on their river. The Canadian people are going to paddle their canoe on their river. And we're going to kind of go downstream together, separately. And we're not interfering with each other, but we're kind of going in the same direction down these parallel paths, right? This is the nature of our relationship. We're walking in the same direction, but we're walking, or in this case, rowing our own path, right? Now, unfortunately, this is kind of, again, where things go wrong because the Canadian government doesn't share a lot of similarity with what Indigenous people want. And so the government, first and foremost, wanted to acquire title to the land, right? So they wanted to actually buy the land from these people. Again, this is going to be a bit of a problem because pretty much all hunter-gatherers, and Indigenous people are no exception here, all hunter-gatherers don't really have a concept of ownership, particularly when it comes to the land, right? So Indigenous people feel that sometimes they feel like that they belong to the land, that they're a part of the land. Sometimes the land is almost like your mother, right? The land cares for you and looks after you. You can't own your mother, can you? Can you own your mother? Does that make any sense? No, that's ridiculous, right? Can you own the air in this room? All of this air is mine. No one else may have this air. Does that make any sense? No, it's bizarre, right? And so for Indigenous people, it was the same thing with the land. And so the idea that one could own the land was like, that's ridiculous. You can't own land. Like, that's crazy. And so there was a bit of a kind of culture clash here between Indigenous people who didn't believe in land ownership and thought that that was ridiculous and impossible and didn't fit with their values. And then there's the Canadian government who is very comfortable with land ownership because people have been buying and selling land in Europe for hundreds of years, right? So these two are going into a negotiation with a very different kind of worldview and perspective about what they can actually accomplish. And so the indigenous people are going to say, okay, we'll allow you to come here and, exist on the land, the land that we have a right to because this is where we come from, and we'll expect certain things of you. And the Canadian government is saying, how much? How much for all of it, right? And so it's not the same thing, right? So the government wants to buy land from these indigenous people. The government wants to encourage rapid settlement of the West, which they do. Agents from the Canadian government during this period are going all over Europe, and they're attending fairs, and they've got fancy posters, which I don't have in this presentation, but I have a little later, and they're saying, come to Canada, it's fantastic, and you can get a farm for cheap, and you can have your own land, and be your own person kind of thing. So they're actually actively recruiting people to come here, and people do. Again, the Canadian government wants to stop Americans from creeping north of the border and settling in their land, because that would kind of destroy the dream of Canada from sea to shining sea, right? You can't have the Americans sticking their nose in the middle of it, right? So we're trying to keep them out. And again, to respond to First Nations request to have treaties as well, right? To come up with an agreement. So what happened is that First Nations people gave up large areas of land to the Crown. But again, they didn't really think they were giving it up. They thought they were allowing, okay, you can come and use the land that we have ancestral rights to. You can come in here and use it. But again, the government thought they were buying it. And what the government was supposed to give them in return were these things. And so Indigenous people wanted some land set aside for them, right? They wanted to continue to fish and to hunt and to practice their traditional lifestyle. And so they wanted some land set aside for that. But they also wanted farm equipment and animals. So they knew that they were going to have to farm in this new country. They didn't really have much experience with it, and so they asked the government for the things they would need in order to farm. They asked for some payment, right? Some money, some yearly money to sort of compensate them. They asked for education for their children, right? So Indigenous parents, just like all of our parents probably, realize that kids need skills to exist in the world of the future, right? And those might be skills that maybe our parents don't have, but our parents recognize that we will need them, right? So they send us to school, just like they've sent all of you to school, and just like my parents sent me to school. And so here, Indigenous parents did the same thing. They said, hey, our kids are going to need skills to survive in this rapidly changing world. There's skills that we don't necessarily have, and so we want schools set up. We want education for our kids. And then they ask for ammunition and clothing, and again, a guarantee of their rights to fish and to hunt on the land. Now, again, things didn't go very well. The negotiation part went really well because, as it turns out, Indigenous people are really smart. And what they would do is the agents from the Canadian government would come to one village, one Indigenous village, and they would sit down and they say, okay, here's what we'll offer you. And the Indigenous people would say, well, okay, here's what we want. And so when they got close to making an agreement, someone from that community would run over to the next community and say, okay, here's what the government promised them. And so when the government agents got to the second village, that village would say, okay, here's our starting point because we know what you promised those other guys. So now we're going to get more. And so they were really clever in their negotiations and were good negotiators. But unfortunately, the Canadian government wasn't too interested in following through on a lot of these commitments. One of the issues is that none of these First Nations people could really read. Again, they're for the most part, they were non-literate societies. They didn't write anything down and didn't really need to. And so when the final versions of the treaties came to be signed, they couldn't actually read them. They had to be read to them. And so eventually they found out that a lot of things that they had negotiated and agreed to weren't actually in the final document. They were somehow mysteriously not there. Yeah, and this is kind of a long quote, but I think it kind of sums it up. And so this is after the signing of one of the numbered treaties, and it says, so the treaty was signed not after, this is a little bit later actually, not after serious negotiations, nor with any spirit of compromise. Governor Laird had come to the session with a treaty in his pocket. This is relative to a time where later on there weren't, as First Nations people became more and more desperate, they just tried to make any deal that they could. And so this is a case where they just wanted to sign an agreement because they didn't have one, and they were in such a desperate situation with no food and no land that they're like, let's sign something. Let's just get an agreement on paper. Yeah, so when they parted company, the commissioners had a document which said that the Blackfoot, who are an Indigenous group from Alberta and a little bit of Saskatchewan, I think, that the Blackfoot had surrendered their lands. The chiefs, on the other hand, believed that they had been promised protection for the buffalo herds and treaty money for allowing the white man to come into their ancestral grounds. Yet, neither side really understood what they'd given away. So to the governor, buffalo preservation and firewood compensation were minor considerations not to be taken seriously. To the chiefs, the selling of their land and the allotment of reserves was beyond their comprehension. And so really nobody was really kind of aware of what they were doing, right? So the governors, the people who were negotiating for the Canadian government, weren't really aware or interested in sort of the importance of what the Indigenous people were asking for. And some of the things that the Canadian government was asking for, the Indigenous people didn't quite understand either, right? Like this purchase of land. What? Right? That doesn't make sense. And so huge numbers of these, not huge numbers, but these treaties get signed, and these treaties are kind of form the basis of the relationship between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples in Canada. After that, this thing is created here, the Indian Act. So the Indian Act is passed in Canadian Parliament in 1876. There's a couple of other things that have been passed before that get combined into the Indian Act. And the Indian Act becomes the document that defines the relationship between Indigenous people and the government of Canada. Okay. Now, really the purpose of this thing was to assimilate Indigenous people, right? So what the Canadian government wanted was an end to what they called the Indian problem, okay? And so whenever you hear about that in history, about if you put like a cultural or ethnic group and then you put problem or question after it, basically it means, how do we get rid of these people? Right? So if you go back to Nazi Germany, you'll see that there was the Jewish question, right? What about the Jewish question? And the question is, how are we going to get rid of these people? Because we don't want them here, right? And it's the same thing here with the Indian problem. The Indian problem, there's no problem. The problem is that you don't want these people here, and you want them to somehow magically go away. And that's the problem that the government is talking about. And so what they attempted to do was to assimilate them. And so the Indian Act has, and I don't know that we have time to really go into it, but the Indian Act has in it legislation that ensures that Indigenous people go to their reserve and stay there. As time goes on, Indigenous people cannot leave their reserve without permission from the Indian agent, who's a government worker. They can't dress in their traditional clothings or costumes. A lot of their rituals and spiritual activities become illegal and become banned. Their land can actually be used. And so there's some parts of the Indian Act that used to say, you know, if the government feels that Indigenous people aren't using their land productively, the government can just take it and use it productively. So again, if indigenous people aren't farming their land and the government decides, oh, we think we should farm this piece of it, they would just farm it. What else is in there? There were laws, parts of the Indian Act determined who was and who was not an Indian person. And so what you wanted in Canada, if you were an Indigenous person, is you wanted a status card. You wanted to be a status Indian. Because if you were a status Indian, that meant that you got the things that the treaties and the Indian Act promised to you, right? So you needed to have status. But of course, who gave you status? Government did, right? And so people were trying to get their status card, but of course, the government would decide who was and who wasn't Indigenous. They also had a very clever way of doing this where if a woman married, how did it go? If a woman married, an Indigenous woman married a non-Indigenous man, she would lose her status and her kids would not have status either. And I think it was the same thing for men. If an Indigenous man married a white woman or a non-Indigenous woman, they would lose their status as well. And so basically what happened is that this rule was set up so that basically, as generations went on, eventually nobody would be a status Indian because people would, if anyone married into the group, they would lose their status and their kids would lose status and then their kids wouldn't have status either. And so eventually what you find out is not the numbers of Indigenous people growing, but actually disappearing because every time anyone else marries into an Indigenous group, their descendants lose their status. And so the government was like, eventually there'll be no status Indians left. They'll just be people. So here's a very telling quote, and I'll point out who it's from. It's from this guy, Duncan Campbell Scott, who's the Department of Indian Affairs superintendent in 1893. So he's the guy in charge of the ministry in Canada that is supposed to look after the relationship between Indigenous people and the government of Canada. And he says, here, I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department, and that is the whole objective of this bill, right? So even if you doubted that the Indian Act was, racist and discriminatory, which it was, and even if you doubted the idea that, it's not designed to assimilate people. What does it mean to assimilate, by the way? Yeah, to mix them in and to kind of make things into one, right? To make two things into one thing. And so here he's basically coming right out and saying it, right? He's like, we're going to continue doing what we're doing until there are no Indians left, right? He's pretty clearly saying it right there.
Why when they're called like Indian, they're Indigenous?
Ah, yes. We didn't talk about that. I used to have a slide in there once upon a time, but maybe we'll talk about it now. So there's a lot of terms that have to do with First Nations people or Indigenous people. And some of them are kind of should be used, and some of them definitely should not be used. So probably the best ones are First Nations because it very clearly describes what they were. They were first, right? We established that they got here first. They are First Nations. Indigenous is a pretty good term as well because for something or someone to be Indigenous means it comes from here, right? So if a certain plant or tree is indigenous to the West Coast, that means it comes naturally from the West Coast. So Indigenous works as well. You'll hear Aboriginal used quite a bit. Depends on who you talk to with that one. Some people are totally fine with it. Some people point out that if you're abnormal, what are you? You're not normal. So if you're Aboriginal, what does that mean? You're not original. But are they not original? They are original, right? They're the original people from here, right? So some people, think Aboriginal's all right. Some people point out the fact that it means not original, and we are original. So don't use that, right? So sometimes Indian came about because the first explorers to come here were looking for a passage to India. And so when they hit the shore and saw these people running around, they said, oh, look, there's a bunch of Indians here. We've made it to India. But of course, they very clearly had not made it to India. They soon found out that, in fact, they were not in India, but the name kind of stuck. And so they were called Indian in the past, even though they have no connection to Indians from India. And really the only way we use it today is in reference to the Indian Act, because the Indian Act still exists, by the way. The Indian Act still exists, and so it's kind of a legal term, and so we're stuck with it at the moment. I wouldn't use it in reference to any indigenous person or group, because it's inaccurate, and it's kind of, it's an old term, and it's kind of not in use anymore. But because we still have this Indian Act thing, we still reference it in that context. But I would go with First Nations or Indigenous people. I think those are the best terms to use. Aboriginal, it depends on who you ask. Right, so the Indian Act was this. It was a tool of assimilation, an attempt to somehow make these people go away, right? These people were kind of inconveniently in the way of the creation of Canada as the government wanted to create it, and wanted to create it as a white Christian country. And of course, these people were, again, inconveniently in the way. And so the treaties are signed, the Indian Act is created. By the way, the Indian Act was created with no input from Indigenous people whatsoever. They did not negotiate that. It was simply imposed on them. And so as this kind of Indian Act comes into force, it gets amended a bunch of times, so a bunch of things get added into it. There's all kinds of ridiculous stuff that used to be in there that now has been removed. But regardless, as it sort of continued to operate, it took a kind of self-governing, independent, strong people, if you will, and basically stripped them of their autonomy. It stripped them of their ability to govern themselves. It stripped them of their ability to even say who they were, right? Because the government tells you if you're an Indian or not you. It banned them appearing in public in their traditional clothing. It banned their spiritual and religious practices. It limited their ability to practice their traditional lifestyle, and basically went about trying to destroy their culture and assimilate them into Canada. And probably the worst culprit of this was probably Indian residential schools. Now, just a quick show of hands, who's heard of these things before? Yeah, okay. Once upon a time, this chapter of Canadian history was not really taught. And so this is something that was not taught to me when I was doing social studies when I was a kid. And I think you can probably intuitively figure out the reason for that, right? Is that it's a dark, ugly chapter of Canadian history. And here in Canada, we like to kind of portray ourselves as a friendly country, right? We're friendly, we're nice, we're the golden retriever of countries, if you will. We like to portray ourselves a certain way. We like to portray ourselves as multicultural and respectful of people's traditions and welcoming and inclusive. And in many ways, those things are somewhat true, or to some degree true. But this is a particularly dark chapter which doesn't conform to that idea, right? It doesn't help us tell that story of how great and welcoming and accepting we are, because this chapter shows that, in fact, in some points in history and with reference to some people in particular, we were not that at all, right? We were the opposite of all of those things. However, before we get into that, maybe we'll take a little breaky, okay? So take a break, come back in 10, and we'll talk about these things here. Okay, and we're back. So, like we mentioned before, things had really gone from bad to worse for Indigenous people in Canada. They, you know, were fine for thousands of years, and then these Europeans came over. Everything was okay initially, but as more and more of them came over, and as the Canadian government was created, the relationship equality between the two started to get out of balance, right? And so the Canadian government became more and more powerful. Indigenous people lost their power and their ability to kind of look after themselves and to live their traditional lives. Yeah, and that kind of brings us to Indian residential schools. And so again, these schools were at first set up to deliver on those treaty promises of education, right? So the Indigenous people wanted education for their children, and here they were. The problem is that the schools weren't really created with education and Indigenous kids' best interest at heart. So these schools were kind of set up across Canada. They were boarding schools, so the kids had to actually go and live at them, like Hogwarts, except, you know, like the worst, the worst version of Hogwarts. And again, the aim of these schools wasn't to educate Indigenous people. They were to give them a very basic level of education, just enough so that they could read and follow orders, but not so that, you know, none of these kids were going to get an education that would allow them to become a doctor or a lawyer. They were going to get basic education so that they could kind of just survive in society. But secondarily, schools were created to assimilate them, to basically, we've talked about socialization and enculturation. These schools were designed to cut that download, right? Cut that enculturation process and instead enculturate them into white Canadian society. And so in part, that's why they were boarding schools, right? They didn't want kids going home, you know, every night and continuing to learn Indigenous culture. And in many cases, these schools were hundreds of kilometers away from where they were from. And so they couldn't even go home on weekends. And some who tried to run away couldn't even run away because they were hundreds of kilometers away from their homes. And so yeah, these schools were, I don't know who said it, this is a popular quote, but he said that they said that their purpose was to kill the Indian in the child. And so you can almost hear this like religious kind of like exorcising a demon kind of feeling to this, which shouldn't have been surprising because most of these schools were run by church groups. And so Catholic churches, Anglican churches, they were the ones who were in charge of these schools. Again, about 30% of First Nations people or First Nations children find their way into residential schools. At first it's optional, but later it becomes a legal requirement. And so again, Indigenous people don't have any choice in this, but the government says that their children must go to these schools, must go to residential schools. Over the course of about 100 years or so, apparently at least 6,000 of these kids die at school. In case you're curious, the appropriate number of students to die at school is 0. No kids should die at their school. 1 is entirely unacceptable. 6,000 is indefensible, right? There's no reason why any kid should die at school, much less 6,000 of them. And to be honest, that number is probably low. The reporting was probably not good. The way that they recorded these things were probably, they probably didn't do a very good job of recording, and so 6,000 is probably low. There's probably more than that. I'm probably going to sneeze in a second, unless it goes away. Sorry, said a sneeze. So again, 6,000 kids die in these schools. But unbelievably, it actually gets worse because these schools were brutal. And so lots of these kids experienced certainly emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse, all while being students at these schools. They had no recourse. Their parents weren't there, right? Their parents weren't anywhere near the school, and they had no way of contacting them. Nobody was overseeing the operation of these schools. And so they were hellish places where kids would be brutally punished, as you can see, for anything, right? And particularly anything regarding their own culture. So if they attempted to sort of do their hair in their traditional way, that would result in a horrible punishment. If they spoke any of their first language, their indigenous language, huge punishment, right? And sometimes huge punishment just because, right? Just because they were indigenous kids. And so, yeah, it's kind of difficult to overstate how brutal these schools were, particularly when you think about the fact that the people going to them are 7, 8, and 9 years old, right? Like awful, awful stuff. Again, kids were isolated from their families for months and months at a time. They were, in many cases, suffered all kinds of different abuse. And again, nobody seemed to really know or care what was going on here. And so some have gone so far as to say that the residential school system and the Indian Act and the sort of actions of the Canadian government should actually be called cultural or even just regular genocide. And genocide's that's a big word, right? That's a heavy word with a lot of, what is a genocide? Mass murder of a group of people? Okay. What else is it? We can probably add to that.
Like a revolution killing people?
A revolution killing people. Sometimes genocides go along with political revolutions, so that's definitely true. Aliana, what do you got for me?
Like a culture or religion.
A group, yeah.
Yes. So there's a particular kind of social group that's usually involved, whether it's a cultural or ethnic or religious group, right? Or racial group sometimes. It can be any of those things. Yeah. So let me just see. Where's my... Nope. Hang on. Let me just see where my slides are. The slide that I thought was coming next did not come next. So I just want to see where I am. Oh, interesting. There we go. That's what I was looking for. My slides are out of order. That's not cool. Right. So this is actually a good point to kind of bring in this idea of genocide. And History 12 people, of course, you'll know that we've talked about this already. The term genocide is kind of made official after the Second World War. And so when the Allied armies roll into Germany and they uncover all kinds of death camps like Auschwitz and Dachau and others, where mostly Jewish people are being exterminated in the most brutal fashion you can imagine, the United Nations gets together and passes a convention on genocide where they define what it is and, of course, condemn it in the process. And so this is what the convention said. It said, acts that are committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And the UN says that you can do this by killing people, which I think we all knew already, but also by trying to destroy people in other ways. So you can impose living conditions that seek to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part of people. So you don't have to kill them, you just create a situation where they can't survive. That still counts as genocide. You can prevent births, and so if you sterilize a group of people, for instance, that still counts because then they won't be able to have any children and their group will come to an end. If you forcibly transfer kids out of their group into your group and raise them as your own, that counts too because it ends that kind of group of people. And so you don't actually have to kill a bunch of people in order to commit a genocide, although in most cases that's exactly what happens. But there's other ways to go about it too. And actually, in some genocides, there's a little bit of this other stuff happening either before or after as well. So, to talk about this, we don't have much time left. To talk about this, I wanted you to read a little article for me, and it's called The Ongoing Legacies of Canadian Genocide. And again, you don't hear those two words put together very often, Canada and genocide, right? Usually we think of genocides as things that happen somewhere else, right? Nazi Germany. What are some other genocides that you know of? Rwanda, right? 1994. Cambodia, right? With Khmer Rouge. What else? There's an Armenian genocide. What's that? Say again? Well, yeah. That's kind of what that's what we're talking about here. But again, you don't hear Canadians kind of implicated in genocide very often, and so that's why it's kind of useful to talk about it here. So what I'd like to do, let's see, I'm going to give you 15 minutes to sort of read over this, and what I want you to do is answer the questions. And the questions I have at the end are basically, well, what are the questions I have at the end? I don't have them in a slide, but what did I ask you here? I'm going to ask you,
What is the author argument in this article?
yes, what is the author's argument in this article? So, conclusion and premises. Second question I'll ask you, and again, these are at the end of the reading. Why might people want to reject this argument? Why might people not want to believe what this author is arguing? What happens if we believe it? Or what happens if we don't believe it? Well, and that's probably as far as we won't even get that far today, so I'll just leave it there. But so the article itself is in Microsoft Teams, where it always is. And so what I'll have you do is I'll give you 15 minutes to read, and then we'll check in after 15 and just kind of see where we are, okay? It's called The Ongoing Legacies of Canadian Genocide. And I'll put actually 23, 33, 38. Yeah, that's good. That's good. muted the whole time. Sorry, I've been muted the whole time. I apologize. That's okay. That's okay. No. Just for the last couple minutes. Sorry, people. It's okay. I'll review everything. You won't miss anything. I promise. Maybe I'll just review what we said and then I'll leave it at that. So we said that there's a bunch of different things that are being argued here. And so it might be a little tricky to come up with one argument because there's a few. And so some of the things that we identified was, yes, there is racism and discrimination that has happened in Canada in the past towards Indigenous people and continues to happen in the present. Yes to the fact that the Canadian government seems to be aware of these inequities and issues, and yet seems to have done nothing. And by the way, those promises that Trudeau made, yeah, those didn't happen. And maybe yes to the idea that what happened in Canada should be labeled a genocide, right? People don't like that word. It's a heavy word. It conjures up, ideas of death camps and Nazi Germany and all sorts of uncomfortable, ugly things. But the author is saying we should think of what's happened here as a genocide. So there's kind of a few things happening all at the same time. And so maybe tomorrow we can look at this one more time and kind of put it together into one thing, maybe. But until then, I think I'll leave it there. So tomorrow, quiz number 3 tomorrow, for online people, and I mean people who are exclusively online, we'll start at 10:05 and I'll do the oral quiz with you through Teams. People who attend class, even if you're not here today, I expect you here tomorrow, unless you've made a previous arrangement with me, and you'll write the paper test at about 11, okay? So as soon as I'm done with the online people, I'll let you into the classroom and then we'll write the paper version, okay? So good luck, everyone. Study hard. I'll see you tomorrow, online people. Goodbye.